The ecosystem of culture, the title of this panel, may be associated with working with a community that is prone to providing forms of survival, and I suppose this panel should take a different perspective. In the framework of cultural activity, we often see disputes over limited resources, if not for anything else. So there is a clash embedded in it. Therefore, we have decided to use this panel to focus on the links between culture and other walks of life, other human endeavors. But having thought about it, we decided to think about bridging mechanisms. In other words, how culture is bridged with other human endeavors, and it doesn't have to be cooperation, and it doesn't always have to be a very smooth type of cooperation with all parties agreeing on the common direction. I suppose we are in a moment in time when words very popular 10 years ago, change or hope, for example, they sort of sound naive today. So the political manifestos are very much very much rooted in culture. So they are no longer relevant, perhaps, today. Therefore, we need to take a closer look at the sources of development as it relates to culture. Today, the biggest buzzwords is defense. The other buzzword of today is status quo. And politics is critical of culture, but culture is perhaps where inequalities are being reproduced and amplified. The rich are getting richer, the weak are getting weaker, etc., etc. So this leads me to a question. How do you see bridging? What is your view of the potential to create a bridge between culture and other human endeavors in the context of culture, the word culture, being a word that makes people perhaps a little detached? Culture may be related to hierarchy, may be associated with something closed up, something that is bottled up, and perhaps sacred, perhaps a realm of experts only. So how do you approach that? And secondly, and this is referring to Professor Hausner's points about the hotspots of culture. They are very often informal hotspots. They don't use the word culture at all in self-description, and they are very hot inside because the relationships, the interactions inside are quite intense. They breed transformations of identity. They foster change. But at the same time, they are threatened by being very inbred and very demanding on the participants. So cultural initiatives that happen beyond the consecrated field of culture, called living culture by Professor Hausner, tend to be autonomous and tend to operate independently of mainstream culture. And being very inbred, which is quite troublesome because it prevents natural linkages. So it doesn't square with the natural propensity of culture to network and to merge and to fork out and link. The charismatic leaders, when they come up with initiatives, the initiatives fail. So all success hinges upon personal resources rather than resources that would be of a systemic nature. So my question is, what unites you all here in this panel are, first of all, attempts to transcend culture. Secondly, you have all been looking for mechanisms that would reach out to groups that have beyond reach or that have been excluded, where, for whom culture was alien. And thirdly, links to economy, links to policy. How does it work here? So to summarize, I suppose we should discuss alliances or bridges, the role of conflict and the potential in conflict in culture, because I suspect conflict helps create identity and value. And thirdly, naming things, labeling things. The role of culture is to label things as cultural, or perhaps is the function of culture to do things rather than label things? So I suggest that we take turns as we are seated here in the order of seating arrangement. So please tell us about your experience, 15 minutes each person, and then we'll have a discussion with the rest of the audience. Over to you.
Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Hello, my name is Vitalie Sprînceană. I'm coming from Oberliht Association, Moldova. It's like the topic we're discussing. It's so complex, and we are constantly working with these questions in our work ourselves, because culture. Let's begin from this. Personally, I am trained as a sociologist, and we sociologists operate with a concept of culture that is so kind of all-encompassing that there are no other, how to put it, domains of human endeavor, because everything is culture. But then, as cultural organization, you are working in a field that is so structured, where there is a thing called culture, which is coexisting along other things called economy, politics, and they're so compartmentalized. But then, as an organization that takes pride and also is active and at the grassroots level, we're operating with another kind of concept of culture, which is different from both the big philosophical concept, but also from the political concept of culture, in the sense that most of the things, to be honest, most of the things that we do are not considered to be culture by the public authorities at the local and the national level. We're a cultural organization, but when we do, for example, workshops with various groups and trying to transmit some knowledge, or to do a collective learning, or like a mutual kind of exercise of learning, that's not considered culture by this official classification. And we're kind of working along all these scales. We have a rather weird history. We started initially as an organization that aimed to provide support for young artists, and hence, like, the full name of our organization is the Association of Young Artists. And in a structure where the artists were gathered in unions of artists, a system that we inherited from old times, like from the Soviet Union, like this young artistic scene, it was kind of appearing, kind of developing, but it was not visible. It was beyond the sight and beyond the reach of the policy makers, of the official official policy in the cultural sector. So we wanted to kind of advocate, or to be the organization that would help these groups of people, of initiatives, of individuals, to make them visible, to somehow make a place for them in the broader cultural field. And we started to work, because we're based in Chișinău, we started to work with public space as one of our tools, and we kind of ended up working in and with public spaces as the general kind of environment of our activity. And then we doing things in public space, like in the beginning interventions, mapping, discussions, we kind of became aware of things that structure public spaces and things that makes public spaces not that public. We discovered that, or we tried through our artistic interventions at the beginning, we tried to make it visible that they are, like, these spaces are not completely, they're not democratic, they're not inclusive, there are some exclusionary mechanisms working there, and therefore, like, we should kind of bring this concept of public space to a new level, where public is really public. So we started to work with various communities, as the, how to put it, this entrepreneurial language calls them stakeholders, various groups of people that use public space. And we moved, kind of, that was like, we still kept the direction of helping, assisting, working with communities of young artists, but we kind of started to move to other problems, or to other kind of fields. And public space, of course, raised or brought to us the question of urban planning. What is the city and who owns the city? What rights do we have as citizens of the city? Where is your voice? Where is our voice in urban planning? And we've started to be like this very weird mixture of activists, artists, but also community organizers and other, but also scientists working with, like, researching what happens. So in a way, like, right now we kind of are at this very weird stage where we don't correspond, like our activities don't match that much the name of the organization, but we're trying to work with, Igor put it rather in an exaggerated way. We don't transform, like, huge quarters or areas of the city, but we work with communities, and that's when you were to open or to kind of enter this discussion about ecosystems, we're working with. We understood, one of the things that we understood from the beginning is that we have to work with, for, but mostly with. We don't have to do things for somebody. It's because we would repeat the same, and this is not the debate about the expert and the community, or does the expert, who knows better. but basically we'll end up repeating the same mistakes if we don't do things with people, because we'll continue the exclusion of communities from the decision making, but also from the production of culture process. So we started with communities, and we are working with communities. We're working with various communities, and this is one of the ways in which we're trying to build bridges. We're working with communities of artists, of course, but also with communities of activists, also with communities of urban planners, with local communities around certain concrete public spaces, but also with kind of scattered communities as journalists. And that's one of the, I would say it's one of the ways to build bridges, is to working with the communities. We strongly believe in participation, and I think that's the other point that I would like to add to this discussion. Because we're working in a context where participation, and I'm fascinated by what's happening in some parts of Europe, where there is this progressive social movements being very active and sometimes even conquering power at the local level. But in my context, in my country, the process is going in the opposite direction. We're witnessing a process, and we're not witnessing it in the sense of like being passive observers, but it's happening despite all our best efforts and intentions. We see a process of governance, of power being taken and being moved in other areas. And it's a very complex process. It's worth discussing in more details, but this is not probably the best, the best moment. But still, it's like we're witnessing a removal of power from the people and moving it somewhere. And it happens not only at the very, very big level, even it happens at the small local level. And this is why we want to do things with the communities, but also empowering them, helping them, trying to make their voice visible, connecting them with other communities of people that know how to do things. And to give a short example, we are active in one area in the center of the city. It was supposed in the Soviet times they wanted to build a huge boulevard that will just cross the city. They didn't build it in the end, but still the idea of the boulevard is kind of there. And there is a small abandoned area. And we're working with that community in the idea of organizing a cultural park, or a public space, but also a center of community life. And in this process, we're working on several levels. On the one level is the physical rehabilitation of the park itself, but also we're working with the community, trying to help that community becoming not the owner of the space. That's a kind of very bad way of saying, but in a way like being the active agent that will take care of that area and will be the kind of the voice that will be dealing with it and will. And the third level is at the institutional level. We're trying to push the city level in Chișinău, like the city authorities. We're trying to push them for new ways of doing things, for new ways of building partnerships. We call it civic-public partnerships, and it's about the city. Anyway, like the background of this action is that the green area anyway is to be taken care of by the city, because the city owns it's the municipal property. But usually the city ignores those spaces, and we want to bring the community as the active participant of that rehabilitation, but also to elaborate some models through which other areas, other communities can come forward and do similar things. For example, coming also with a proposal, and there is, and here is where the things kind of become very difficult, because it's an idea as simple as that, and it works very, very, very difficult at the Chisinau city level, because the city has other plans, has other priorities, because the inhabitants are not considered to be competent enough to have a view on how public spaces in their neighborhood should be looking or should be taken care of. So I would say, like, besides like doing with the people and working with them and stimulating participation, the other thing is we have to aim to, or this is, and it's from our context, we have to aim for transforming the institutional landscape. And there are many great examples around. I'm very sorry to say that from Moldova there is no one yet. No, like, we're trying to push the things, and it's kind of very difficult. So more or less this is the context, and this is how we are trying to bridge those connections to other spheres. I think, like, in kind of a short conclusion, I think that we should move generally beyond this, how to put it, established, like this usual compartmentalized concept of culture, because culture is everything, and once, like, we take it also as a kind of activist point of view, or a kind of a banner for struggle. Culture is everything. So we're trying to include in that concept of culture very all-inclusive kind of everyone. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So thank you for inviting me here. I feel really honored and to be in this panel, and also to have the opportunity to hear you all speak. Thank you, Igor, for portraying me in such a nice way. My name is Xenia Kalpaktsoglou, and I have been actively working as a curator, let's say, for the last almost 16 years. I really consider more significant and definitive the 11 years I have been running the Athens Biennial with two friends that we started it in 2005, let's say during the post-Olympic Games CASAP. Like Igor said, I decided to step down in last July, and I think maybe today I can briefly mention something about this shift in my professional status, also in kind of comments on how I'm dealing with this, or what brought me in this situation, which is a constant, let's say, negotiation. So by default, everything I will say to you are empirical and maybe non-conclusive, but I will try to raise some questions. Let's, if I pick up from your introduction, let's say, and maybe taking into consideration, we started the biennial in 2005 with those keywords that you described as of now, the defense and the status quo. We actually believe with my colleagues that culture represents a very stratified field that is completely non-inclusive, and it only happens to represent itself as being inclusive. So the three of us being completely disconnected from normal policy making or abilities to, let's say, work within a field in a proper manner, and having, living actually in a very chaotic state that allows independent initiatives to thrive because there is no control system, but not necessarily to flourish. Yeah, they can initiate but not necessarily move forward. We kind of took the liberty of selecting one of the most celebrated but also one of the most debatable terminologies, which is the biennial, that represents a lot of things. And for us, the CATS was also for, it was a double bind, both as a, let's say, regulatory and self-disciplinary choice because of the temporality of the event. So usually in my country, things have no continuity. Let's say things pop up and then they stop, and that was also the feeling, let's say, of post-Olympic euphoria or flop. So let's say we decided to commit into a structure that we had to constantly keep on running. There was like a promise or a date that was renewed, and there was no turning back. It wasn't just raising something. And at the same time create the conditions of, let's say, an institution that was not private, because we had a lot of private institutions, and it was not state with everything that followed the state. So basically the idea was to challenge a lot of things, but it came from a very, let's say, self-reflective position. We didn't have this kind of big plan of how, but of course via practice a lot of things changed. So I would say that, but from the initial idea was to create a model, let's say. We didn't know if it was going to be an institution, but contrary to popular belief and against our better judgment, we're still running after so many years. We wanted to create a model that was constantly tested and modified by peers. It was a very small gesture within a group. And I mean, to the extent that as we moved forward in 2013, we offered to share this kind of responsibility with a larger group of 42 people in the edition of Agora, or in the previous edition in 2015-16, we actually tested the limits of whether we can hand out the governance or we can share the governance in a long term with others. But as time went by, and I think within the context that I was working, I'm almost haunted, let's say, by this question that was posed quite some time ago by Lars Bag-Larsen and Søren Andersen, and this is almost like a mantra for me. When curators are no longer custodians of eternity, they must reflect on their own institution's legitimacy. So this legitimacy for me, and being also somebody who created it, was something that I had to seriously consider. And of course, I would have to say that these bridges that you have created, we have all been mentioning, or the culture, we have definitely within the cultural field, and particularly within the biennial field, we have really excelled into them. And I think this is where we need to readdress maybe certain things. For example, let's say, because just to move forward on this, and I will try to make a brief categorization of what I understood the biennial practice, but overall the curatorial practice post-2009, if you allow me this kind of theory, is that post-2008, we had citizens movement, direct democracy attempts via squares, occupation, and basically the renunciation of politics, and the growing mistrust in power structures and in institutionalized, institutional representations. So that was a key for us as having an institution. I think this did not only destabilize the modus operandi of a biennial. For example, we had less and less money, and we had to foster more and more this kind of perception of what a biennial is, both internally to our peers and collaborators, but also externally to the public or to sponsors or to collaborators. But it was mostly on a symbolic level. And because in culture we used to operate mostly on a symbolic level, and in some cases we do, but now, like my colleague said, we're trying to make another kind of approach on a more practical, material, let's say. This brought back with great intensity, I think, not only to myself, but to many colleagues, this perception of the biennials or culture as a neoliberal token, yeah? Or neoliberal playgrounds, where the temporalities that by default are short allow for this kind of exuberance and hope to be created in like 90 days, 80 days, 60 days, and it almost acts as a safety valve. And I think as time went by, because we had to address different antinomies, that they were always present. Like you have to balance these fundamental characteristics, which means temporality, a diverse pool of funding sources. I mean, if 2 years ago, the main, let's say, accusation when we tried to create these bridges with grassroots initiative was a growing suspicion of where do you get your money from. So it was, again, a talk, I mean, going beyond, let's say. And also your links, inevitable links with institutions and authority, like the state, the municipality, and how they operate. And I think this, which is a given within at least where I come from in terms of operation, combined with all these over-determined, almost I would say, and I'm sorry, this is self-critic, messianic concepts that the curators and artists are making in terms of change are bringing us in a very, very bad situation. And I think they have a backfiring effect to the extent that if they make us look even more speculative and I think almost cynical, and in some cases, if we continue down this road, I think our work would be irrelevant totally. I mean, for the short term, it could be. So I would say that there are three different, let's say, ways that I have identified that we have been taking into account all these doubtful rhetorics. I think I'm not the only one who's addressing this, and I'm not somebody who woke up one day and said, oh, biennials or art is like this. I think a lot of people have been saying it, and they have been sincerely trying to take these rhetorics into their account, and the response is varied. And I would try to highlight, let's say, the most prevalent ones that I think are not operational. I'm just going to tell them, but in my view, is where I'm standing now, I think they're also non-operational, regardless of good intentions. So firstly, I think we were becoming embedded in the context within which we were working. Both artists and cultural practitioners, not just dislocating an exhibition, let's say, which happened if we set the tone from the Oqui and Vezor Documenta, but also relocating ourselves to host cities for extended periods. And this was almost like a badge of honor in terms of being there, and also something that would validate our presence and our, let's say, relation to this. I mean, for me, this is not an issue because unlike many of my peers, instead of trying to have to work outside my country, I always invested in working within the country. So let's say this is a differentiating factor. The second thing was we were expanding always the exhibition duration. So in a sense, we were representing a continual process of negotiation where different areas, let's say cultural, financial, political, geographical, they coexist and they form each other. So there is a big weight in this kind of preparatory or like durational part of the exhibition. And thirdly, I think, and this is the most fashionable, but also the most important and also the most tricky, is by endorsing public participation via placing the local community in the forefront. I mean, this third element is exemplified actually with a focus on this grassroots movements engagement, domestic models of public art, as well as notions of commoning, which were applied into across different contexts. So, this also reflected in methodologies, let's say, and then concept and methodologies all became tangled up, and this is where other misunderstandings and other confusions arise. For example, we exemplified collective work, like sharing responsibility and thus delegating authority in a stratified and surely authoritarian, I mean, in art, everybody signs, this is a very, let's say, significant part of identity of people who are in the cultural field. So by delegating authority to a larger group of curators or advisors, we call them agents, epitomize this approach and actually supposedly safeguards the democracy or the participatory element of the exhibition. To expose all these tensions that come with the territory, we created a series, we adopted a series of approaches by creating, let's say, and I'm now quoting phrases from press releases of biennials, shared spaces for conviviality, open source toolboxes, production sites, academies and schools, assemblies, agoras, and parliaments. One could argue this build up from different trajectories, let's say the laboratory, the platform that were like 15 years ago. So at the same time, I think artists and curators seem to have been focusing very much on art labor, which is very interesting for me coming from a middle class background. And the current professionalization, let's say, or institutionalization of the cultural field, which is also much debated, alongside, let's say, the economic and social divisions, with what was considered outdated. And for me, it's very nice to hear it, to see it put firmly back into the agenda, the class issue. That was also, I mean, if you remember from boycotts in big exhibitions to also issues that have to do with representation or immaterial labor, wage movements by cultural producers, etc. So, like I said, I think even though the majority of our production and curatorial discourse advocates either polemically other times or more poetically, depending on the messenger, a commitment to the social, and while it recognizes in this attempt the need to address the politics of its own setting, and this is mainly my problem, meaning its own position within the established institutional sphere, the possibilities created, I believe, to establish something other than a curatorial precedent still appear to be limited. And if those limitations are not acknowledged and subsequently addressed, I think, and definitely beyond the confined exhibition time, I think, like I said in my introduction, these undertakings would be basically obsolete and largely irrelevant. So just to conclude, I will also conclude in a similar way. I think now, I believe we should be more context instead of content providers, if I can put it crudely in that division. The context that I have been participating with the biennial, I think had specific genealogical characteristics in its DNA that reached the point for me that it could not be more, let's say, flipped over. We have done a lot of acrobatics in dealing with its own legacy, its own institutional status, its own curatorial approaches, the artistic discourse. But in that respect, I think I don't think it is still possible for us, artists and curators, to still believe that we are on the other side of power. Like, because we live in a space and we have to acknowledge this. So this might help us also in positioning ourselves within this. And work towards into not making reductions via concepts, but actually working within institutional structures and create the governance by this kind of self-operating mechanism. I don't know how, that it could definitely keep on testing this and allow possibilities for this process to be continuous, so when things pop out and they are materialized or branded, let's say, we can still keep a possibility of creating other mechanisms. So not just, feel comfortable when something arises out of this kind of conditions or situations of participation and materializes, but also constantly have the opportunity to feel in this process via always prototyping within culture different types of governance, institutional practices, etc. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Emina. I'm coming from Zagreb and now Rijeka since recently, both Croatia. I'm really happy to be here, and I would also like to thank you very much for inviting me. It's hard for me to speak after all these questions posed at the moment, and I will try to drive a few confusing thoughts throughout this presentation. I'm thinking like, okay, one should always be, organized, have a nice structure of your speech, etc., etc. But in the other sense, this is probably some kind of desperate attempt to try to understand the world, which is everything but that. So we'll combine these two, I hope, and I hope I will manage to communicate with you, which would make sense, otherwise it wouldn't. I would start following on what Xenia was saying about the art world today, and especially visual arts, but yeah, let's keep it there. The thought that is really eating my brain for quite a while now is the thought about the arts market and this craziness of value, so-called economic value, that is put into paintings like, I don't know, Klimt's paintings, the millions and millions and millions that cannot be understood, and that are not even, of course, they are not in public museums anymore, they're not even in, people are not having, the super rich people are not having these works in their homes to enjoy them, but they're keeping them in some safes somewhere in Switzerland, just exchanging money. So the art became the most, I guess, sustainable and the smallest thing to keep millions in itself. So what to do with this? I was always, the one, in this dispute, there is a fire and there is a last copy of Shakespeare's Hamlet and a person, and I would always say Hamlet, yes. But in this sense, I think the first step to anything change in the arts world would be to burn down these pictures, because they don't serve anybody. They're just serving to preserving money. And this is preserved position of our society and arts today. That's one picture. The other picture, which I think it's more or less shared here, is this idea of the arts world or cultural sector, whatever you want to call it, as something super special, as something that exists beyond our society, that belongs to understanding of some special people that are educated and so on. A very elitist, of course, understanding of art, which is happening, let's be frank, both at the institutional level and independent level. Of course, this is the culture of experts and expertise, which I also think should be maybe not ruined, but questioned. At least questions, because if we in arts and culture are going to keep these gates up, if we are going to trying to keep this position of telling people what is good or not, what should be understood as great art and what shouldn't be understood as a great art, we are kind of keeping ourselves out of that society. So in that sense, it doesn't make maybe that much sense to talk about institutional culture, independent culture, private, creative industries, and all this. But it's more about, and I agree with this, how we do understand culture today. I'm not talking about this social definition of culture. Of course, culture is everything around us because it's a civilization. But for me, I was never. I'm in this sector for almost 20 years. Sector. I hate this word, and I'm still repeating it because I don't know what is that sector. It's some different things, some different actions that are having into their focus technology, the digital dimension, the change that is produced by technology, or technology that is produced because of the social change. Social, but not in a sense of helping these privileged people or groups, etc., but social as a social agency, or I rather call it political. It seems to me that we are kind of sometimes afraid of the word political, which is also corrupted in many senses, as we can see around us. And then we talk about social as a more polite way, but it seems to me that if we talk even about social culture, the term I like very much, and thank you, Igor, that we also can talk about political culture, because dealing with society, including communities, different practice we have heard about, this is political action. I'm sure about this. Communities. I think, from my perspective, is this approach that there is no one big community defined by the territory, and we should have them all. But for us as groups working with different groups, it was always interesting to recognize some specific groups that are happening around different issues. Not that much about territory or identity as such, national identity, religious identity, and so on, but more about interest. Of course, there is arts, different types of arts, which wouldn't this differentiation between the art that represents something, the big art, the elite art, and the other types of arts. But art, of course, and different art practices are super interesting today and have different potentials connected with all the other aspects. talking about technologies, political communities, arts, it's hard to avoid, and this is what happened also, urban politics or the issue of public space, because this is where it happens, the negotiations around the public space, which makes clearly, and it's easily to understand because it's physical, the dimension of public good or common good and common interest. Also, it's always connected to cultural policy, which in the end, in this almost 20 years, I'm more or less into this conclusion that cultural policy doesn't make any sense if there is no cultural politics, and usually cultural field tries to avoid politics and gets into technocratic policy, defining strategies, etc. But actually, if there is no political statement in a cultural policy, this policy doesn't make any sense. And more recently, the issue of economy. The scene I'm coming from, which we could call independent or whatever, political, etc., this is my background, has always been, how to say, quite negative about Richard's Florida ideas, creative industries, and all this talk. But some other ideas about the economy came from other fields of action, these days called good economy or circular economy, connected with the sustainability issues, social entrepreneurship, etc. It suddenly started to make sense also for us in culture. Why I'm saying this? Because I think this is an environment I'm interested to work with. I think something we can share, and we can see it not as an alternative to the system. We were always trying to avoid this term alternative, because it means you don't exist without the mainstream. So it's something else. I don't care actually about the mainstream in that sense. We are building something different. Concerning methods, it was always about networking, about cooperation, and about participation. But participation, in my experience, and experience I can hear from many other colleagues around the world, never happens by itself. The movements that are based solely on a participation and completely ideologically flat hierarchies, etc., they usually can't last for long. They usually can't last if the numbers are becoming bigger. There must be some kind of leadership. But it should be some kind of, we can call it inclusive leadership or whatever, because there must be some way of taking responsibility. If we leave it flat, when everybody is responsible, then in the end, nobody is. So much so for just this brief description of the way of thinking. I'll give you one example. I think that could be interesting. The pogon, which in English would be both drive and factory plant. That's why we are not translating it. It's a kind of strange hybrid. Still, I think it's a good hybrid that has this approach of not working against this system as an alternative to the system, as an, how you call it, autonomous zones outside of the system, but tries to use the system to hack it, in a way to hack it, and within it to build something different. I share with you this critique of cultural institutions, the state cultural institutions, cities cultural institutions. In my country, they are really obsolete. Many of them are stuck not in 20th century, but in 19th century or before. Many of them are not connected. They don't know what is happening in the real life. They're living somewhere else. They don't care. This is this experts culture, etc. And many of them are not working well, even for arts and art sector they're representing. I mean, in my country, we have the Central Museum of Contemporary Art that didn't put, the major exhibitions of the major contemporary artists of Croatia, and this kind of This kind of things. And of course, all the resources, or 90% of the resources, of course, state and every other, even the sponsorship money, etc., goes to these institutions. And in this kind of environment, independent scene has been reacting in many different ways, negotiating, protesting, and not to describe the whole process for many years, but also understanding that the change is possible for specific interests of independent scene, and then the groups, social groups, we have been working for or working with, that it won't be sustainable for us to stay as a total aside of a system. It just wasn't sustainable, you know, after Soros Foundation left the region and etc., etc. Then we need to think also for our interest, but also from the interest of development of culture, new types of institutions or new types of managing resources. Therefore, Pogon was the first institution that was made on this model public-civil partnership, in which, in this case, we think of a concrete partnership with the city of Zagreb, in this case, on one side, and the local network of different organizations, independent organizations that are co-partners and co-owners and of this particular institution. This is important because otherwise the governance of the institution is completely controlled by politics, by local governments in most cases. But in this sense, we are not talking anymore about participation in decision making. But you know, the problem with participation, there is always somebody else who decides what from participation will be taken or not. You know, these open public debates about the legislations that are necessary because European Union. This is all fake. We all know it. Urban planning, public debates, everything is fake because this participation without consequences mostly. Here we talk about a co-partnership and co-ownership and co-responsibility in that sense, where you have a power, which is city, and something which is usually not that powerful, which are the network of civil society organization in an equal position regarding the institution. Of course, this is formal. In a sense of real power, resources are, of course, in the hands of city, but some other type of power, it is made from this other side. And of course, this wasn't made just like this, because this system means that the one in power is giving to somebody else, at least part of their power. Why should they do that? Of course, they're not going to do it just like this, because one has to become an actor important enough or dangerous enough in our case, so the one with the power would agree to give up a little bit of power. Together with this system, Pogon has a programmatic system which is also different. We don't have an artistic director. We never thought we need one. Because our logic of our institution was to be an open space for many different initiatives, groups, organizations, whatever, who would do programming that would fit in our, what we called very broadly, contemporary arts and culture. So, whatever. In a system of, you know, in a clear, oh shit, I have to use this word, transparent, but really transparent system where this resource is understood as a both public resource and common resource. It's not only common for those who are part of the network, but it's open to everybody, therefore public under same conditions. Nobody has, you know, all the Fridays there. Nobody has any kind of special position, so this resource is available to everyone in a same return. And I have to say, we started in 2009. I think it was the opening, and for many years this thing is going quite well. Bumpy road, a really bumpy road, but in the end, I think it has its results. But regarding all our all the goals we had, which were more political, about the change of the city, about the change how the city is run, how the cultural policies are run, we understood and somehow the flow took us, that it's not enough to deal with issues of culture and cultural policies, that actually these issues are broader. And therefore, in parallel to this process, with Pogon, a separate initiative formed of the cultural actors, environmental actors, young activists, formed the Right to the City initiative, which dealt with many other issues of the city. I'm not going to go into many protests and so on, and so it's a long story. But it's interesting now that also this activist initiative, it's understood that even that is not enough, confronting, protesting, doing this. But now the same people, and I'm a little bit sad that I'm not involved as I moved to Rijeka, formed a political party called Zagreb is Ours, with even broader, with a broader coalition of many different people, based on this model that it works like a platform that wants to encourage citizens to get active politically. It's going out now. It will be interesting to see the results because our local election is on 21st of May. I think it's very hard for them because there is no usual money parties have, so they have to collect money, by individual donations. They are quite blocked by the mainstream media because, of course, the media are more or less controlled or want to be friends with those in power. But we will see. I'm quite open to be optimistic about it. So that some results will be served. Because all this period, I have to also say politically, we didn't dare or couldn't, for different reasons, organize ourselves politically. This space was filled, in our case, not that much by the right-wing populists, but some kind of populists you cannot even understand where they belong to. And you can see that the people around us, and we are those people in the same, we need some kind of new political answer for the situation we live in. And this is not only at a local level, this is of course at a level of Europe, if not broader than this. I mean, we are in war, this is obvious, but nobody says it. And what are the next steps we can do? How can we react when we have censorship and a big, we share Frljić. We had Frljić also as an intendant of National Theatre in Rijeka, and probably you may say a little bit more about how it became difficult to talk critically and be critical about things like church and Pope and this 10 years ago you wouldn't think so that anybody would, that this would be an issue, like, okay, theater, the space of freedom of expression, this is something which we take for normal, but it's not there anymore. And my last words, because I have to say that I'm now in a position of the mainstream. Well, European capital of culture, what can be more mainstream than that? But in this crazy town of Rijeka, this is also made differently. I will tell you that I'm happy that this is a little bit different city. A city that had Oliver Frljić for intendant. Who would leave Oliver Frljić for intendant? The crazy director that is always provoking of the biggest institution, where the Museum of Contemporary Art is run by artists, a symbol of an independent scene, which is not, following the person who is not following what has been said by their bosses. Slaven Tolj from Dubrovnik had a big fight there with a lot of, and so on and so on. I'm really happy that I can share that in Rijeka, even institutions, public city institutions, are really, most of them, not all of them, there are some old types of museums and all that, are really understanding deeply, and especially people that are leading these institutions, that the old type way, we are producing great art and you are there to see it and appreciate it, it's gone. And these institutions are really working on what I can call again social cultures, and are really dedicated to it, because I think these people understand their work doesn't make any sense if it does not make sense to the communities around us. Thank you.
A lot has already been said, and I'll try and be concise. I wanted to say how I see the ecosystem of culture, the bridges and the conflicts, from the standpoint of a director of a city institution, a municipal institution, a theater. I think that the main problem, the main axis around which the conflict revolves is elitism, and what happened during the last elections in Poland also highlights this trend, this resistance against the elites, this anti-elitist backlash globally. When you have movements against the elites, when you have movements that want to either topple or destroy the elites. This distinction into elite and masses clearly stems from the growing social and economic divisions, the disparities in the economy. And I think that's one of the main axes of the conflict globally. In Poland as well, but it also has to do with the theater and with our work, with my work. The theater as an institution, the theater as an art form, is elitist to some extent. It's highbrow. Theaters like Teatr Powszechny, with its long history, with many outstanding productions under its belt, is a name that's known in Poland, that's known globally. We're trying to produce new work. And all this activity requires outreach, going out to the public, to the audience, being communicative, being comprehensible, being understood, a service, a mission, a duty. A lot of money is spent on theater. Everybody's saying there's not enough money, but there's a lot of money, in fact. This is money that doesn't go to daycare, kindergartens, security, old age homes. This is money spent on theater. And this imposes a lot of duties, and this is a challenge, this is an obligation. A theater ticket in Warsaw costs between 10 and 40 euros. And this is money that you have to pay, but the subsidy or the money you could get by dividing a theater's budget by box office numbers, by audience numbers, is between 15 and 110 euros. So the average subsidy is 50 euros per theater ticket. And this is a public subsidy for culture. When a ticket costs 20 or 12 euros and a couple goes out, that's 40 euros. So you know where the support is directed, the subsidies. The subsidies go to people who can afford the price of a theater ticket, even if subsidized. And that's where the money goes. That's who benefits. So that's one of the mechanisms that leads to social stratification. There's a lot of these mechanisms. They're economic. They're mechanisms that have to do with education, that have to do with a place of residence, your address. And as for the work we're doing here in this theater, we're thinking what we can do to reduce the exclusion, to mitigate. And its mechanisms are very serious, because for us in culture, they lead to audiences shrinking. When these mechanisms come into play, come into effect, there are groups of theater goers, avid theater goers, regulars who see more and more productions, who read more books, but there are groups who drift away from theater and culture, and this translates into what we're seeing in politics at the moment. And it also translates into shattering the erosion of the community that we're dealing with. I think I see culture as a staircase. What I mean is certain events in theater, certain books require a degree of sophistication, education, money, and they're on the higher steps. But the whole ecosystem is a series of complementary steps, one leading to the next. And I always thought how to get people to get in the door, once people get in the door, how to lead them up the steps towards a production that requires erudition, that requires understanding. I'm the theater director, but I'm also a stage director, and I want to do new, innovative things, but I want to do things that people understand as well. And here I see a role for this ecosystem, for this cooperation, for this shared, to building these stairs together. And so to apply the metaphor geographically, it's like we have Teatr Powszechny, which is on this side of the river, Vistula. We're in the Praga district of Warsaw, which is, this is Warsaw B. This is it's seen as a second-class Warsaw, but at the same time, it's the place where Warsaw residents have been living for generations. The left bank of Warsaw, of the Vistula, was demolished during the war, while the right bank survived. Teatr Powszechny is a bastion. It has an inner courtyard. It has a wall. It has something like a moat. In fact, you have gates. You have doors upon doors upon doors. There's so many barriers that you have to cross to enter the inner sanctum. We've had stars, we've had celebrities, we've had great productions. And then we have Ząbkowska Street nearby, where people from the Praga district have been living for generations. And this combination of the left bank infringing on the right bank and so on, it's very important. The theater as a culture institution, a theater as a place of highbrow art can achieve this somehow. So we're trying closely to cooperate with those organizations, with those people, with those communities that are present here, with local associations, local societies, neighborhoods. We have the Open Ząbkowska project in the summer, when we do street performance and plays outside the theater. As you may have noticed, there's a community garden where we're also trying to reach out beyond the walls of the theater so as to achieve this connection, not just artistically, but also socially, in a community context. We're trying to include the residents of Praga, the residents of Warsaw, to invite them to take part in a discussion. And I think that everything we're doing, we're trying to achieve through art. It's like, as Joseph Beuys said, it's like social sculpture. And all the elements are just parts of a greater whole, of a greater. Part of the theater has been handed over to Strefa Wolnosłowa. Alicja Borkowska will be on the next panel. It's an association that works with immigrants, refugees, as well as Prague residents. In the second part of the theater, we have a music club, Muzg, where the Muzg Association is also running that. And these are attempts at coming together and creating an ecosystem. A lot has been said about similar actions. In Warsaw, there's a culture development program, culture encouragement program, that's trying to introduce this type of approach. And there is an exchange, there is cooperation and coexistence. But on the other hand, as we've already said, the political situation has changed and it's becoming difficult. And this field, this form of cooperation, this coexistence, seems currently slightly challenged or even threatened. I think that what's happening right now, what we'll be seeing in the foreseeable future, is an attempt at redefining done by the Ministry of Culture. As I've heard that the Ministry of Culture is working on a new system, setting up a new system of associations. And as for politics and all political and ideological content is being highly promoted, and this threatens and it might lead to financial censorship, which is something that we're witnessing at the moment, and which is affecting a lot of milieus, it's something that we're being affected by. We're looking at alternative sources of funding. Funding by the ministry the ministry seems to have different priorities. And there's hope, or we're pinning our hopes on local government, hoping that they will help expand this realm of freedom, and the Warsaw local government, the Warsaw authorities, and the curse, the Frilich's production of the curse has had the support of the Warsaw city authorities. So anyway, looking for a new system, looking for new ways of ensuring, of safeguarding the independence and freedom in culture. So on the one hand, you have these community activity, which requires a lot of work. We have daily workshops, meetings. We work with associations, as I've said, NGOs. And this is a long-term endeavor that requires patience, that's very extensive. And also we have works of art that can become, facts, that can change the situation, that can achieve a lot more than this this meticulous work, such as the curse, Frilich's The Curse, which has become an important element of public debate Today at 6:30 p.m., two right-wing organizations will be picketing the theater. I hope it'll be peaceful, but this changes the way we see cooperation. It redefines the zones of conflict. It redefines the way people working in culture can come together along with audiences, and these divisions are also brought to the fore. I'd like to thank our panelists. So we started off with a bit of we had a delay, so we have some time for discussion. Now let's hand it over to our audience members, And now let's hand over to the public. Could we ask for questions or comments? And if you don't use the microphone, you will not be translated.
I suppose I forgot the name of the gentleman who said that the society might be split between the elite and the rest. I suppose it's not the problem that there is a split, there is a divide, but the problem is that there is no mutual flow of information between the two. Pondering on whether this divide between the elites and the masses comes from economic premises might be an effort of secondary importance, I suppose. One should wonder, however, how to make sure that these two layers work together, or at least communicate together, communicate with each other. If I may take this question, I'm not sure I know what to do, but let me share a feeling, a sense of guilt I have. Ever since the end of the political transition, when I graduated and I started working for theatre, I've tried to build a theatre which is a social theatre, a critical theatre, a realm of art that speaks for the excluded and has social cause on the horizon. I suppose there's been a group of people doing this. However, looking back, I see that this has split and has drifted away, and it has been a failure, basically. It's been really contributing to even more divides. So I'm now wondering how to find the reconnection. And I admit I've failed so far. I'm a director. I manage the theatre. I've had tools. I've had the instruments. I've had the power to make things happen. And I suppose things have drifted in the wrong direction ever since. Grzegorz Antoszewski, I understand that you mentioned your guilt. It's not your guilt, it's the guilt is of Donald Tusk's, the former prime minister, and which is a powerful political claim of the opposition. But I suppose it's been a major omission, things that have not been done to reconnect the masses and the elite. And I suppose this is a basic premise that we should put into the political realm, because both Moldova and Greece and Croatia seem to be experiencing the same thing. People disrupt others and are disruptive. There are obstacles and snags, and we should stop. We should put it to a stop here in this country. We should have alternative funding sources. We should be 5 steps ahead. I read this morning on Facebook this dramatic plea of a friend of mine, a soloist of the Warsaw Chamber Orchestra, Justyna Recinelli. She said that they have to collect money, raise money to publish a CD, and the Warsaw Chamber Orchestra being on the brink of non-existent. I don't know how this ends. I've been protesting almost every day in the streets of Warsaw. I recently met Professor Stępień, a constitutional lawyer, with whom we discussed the 3 independent executive branches of government, the Constitution or the Constitutional Court, etc. I suppose the Constitution and the content of the Constitution should be adhered to and complied with by everyone, and we should defend it. We may have problems with the Constitution, some issues with it, but we have to be guardians and stewards of it, and I suppose I should, and I will defend it. Marek Siedniowa, I will continue with the theme of elites. Don't you believe that Central and Eastern Europe has seen a split of elites? We have three elites: financial elite, political elite, and the intellectual/cultural elite. Three different elites, very little overlap between them. And when you look at civilizational advancement of countries, when we look at countries that are affluent and established, we have middle class in such countries, and they are very large. The middle classes are huge and vast, so they breed and sort of create the three types of elites, but with a much common area, shared area between the three, big enough for a country to be stable. Here, in this region, I claim that the splintering of elites into three categories is a source of problems that we are all experiencing now. Are there any questions of panelists? Okay, I suggest that we have that I have one statement of wrap up, and then I will hand over to you. Being intentionally provocative, I will say that you focus on working with rather than for. You mentioned that resources should be shared, etc., etc. What was very powerful in Emina's Emina's intervention was that without new initiatives in public sphere that are not called culture, that do not have the consecrated symbolic sphere, without this boost, without this shaking, culture will be an isolated island. This leads us to a question, and it has already been alluded to, by the way. Any position you take in culture is ideological, political. Do you believe that we can prevent building tribalism, whereby there are separate tribes fighting each other, nothing in common, are not sharing anything in common, and are just fighting to win?
It's a very complex question because it ponders in a way on many kind of not local but very, very general, I would say, and even philosophical kind of interrogations. I think on the one hand, and I'm speculating now, so allow me this kind of liberty because your question was speculative in a way. Like I'm, in a way, I like this fear of tribalism. I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating and I'm building a fake puppet or a fake, I don't know how it's called in English, but yeah, fake phantom, and then I'm fighting it. I don't fear that much. Like I see or I feel behind this fear of tribalism kind of the fear of conflict, And if this is the case, I don't think we should avoid conflict. We should really not encourage, but kind of take the attitude or the point of view that conflict is normal.
Którego wcale nie powinniśmy unikać. Powinniśmy raczej uznać, że konflikt jest rzeczą normalną, natomiast powinniśmy tworzyć i mechanizmy, i instytucje, i pewne ramy, w których te konflikty mogą
they're taking different stairways to something very generally thought as the common good, as the commons, as like that is my kind of umbrella under which think of. So in this sense, I'm not afraid of tribalism. I'm not afraid of ideology. I don't know why ideology became this kind of bad word and we're avoiding it, and I understand that there is, and this is part of the ideological narrative that is being imposed on the world, like, look, there is ideology, which is nonsense, it's not serious, and there is like serious business, and let's govern the world according to the serious rules of the non-ideological guys, which is completely wrong and completely not true, and it is an ideology. And that would be kind of my very short answer. I want, I don't know, like a comment, because there was this comment about the elites, and I don't have any answers to that, but I wanted to make a comment from the point of view of the region I'm living, and maybe even from a very subjective. The second is that in my country, and I don't know what is happening in other parts of the world, but there is this division between political, financial, and intellectual elites is not existing, because what we see in my country is the coincidence, the overlapping of political and economic elites. They're the same. And it's not only they're the same, they're put in kind of hierarchical order, whereby the economic elites control the political elites. So in a way, we're a normal country. We just became a normal country in the sense like the economic interests, or the economic power kind of has taken power over the political one. And the intellectuals, like the intellectuals, I don't know, it's probably our way of kind of making ourselves feel good when we're saying about elites, because it's just a way of saying that we're really not intellectual elites, or like they're not, I don't think there are intellectual elites in my country. But it's not about this, it's about when we're talking about these categories as a sociologist, I must say that like also that elites, it's not just a descriptive kind of term. It also comes with a lot of other things and strings attached, and it creates a lot of distortions. And the problem is that these kind of things, in a way we know where it leads. Like having elites, it's not only a descriptive category, but elites kind of become feeling entitled to do something, to skew, to kind of distort the political system so that it will fit their needs and their views. And it's an eternal problem in a way. My subjective contribution to this is like I'm very sad in a way to see that in my country, like the thing is that these mechanisms that at one point created possibilities for masses to join the whatever called elites are being stopped, are being shut down. The social elevators are not functioning anymore. Myself, I'm a peasant boy. I was born in a small village. My grandmother is illiterate, basically because she survived the famine, and she's still living in that small village. And with the European Cultural Foundation and the Connected Action for the Commons, I've had the chance to attend a thing that I would not think I would be able, or it would be possible in my life, like to go to a reception where there was a princess. And like imagining what this means for the village boy that was kind of, I was going to this rural school, but I was lucky because we had a very nice public educational system, we had a very good public healthcare system, so it was possible for me. There was a step, I took this step, I got good education, I I hate saying like I was good at it and this is my credit. No, I was kind of good, but there were these mechanisms in place that took me and put me forward. Now I see all these mechanisms disappearing in like the chances of village boys like me to get even to the university are becoming kind of smaller and smaller. And that's the problem with the so-called the masses. The thing is that we are now living in a system where the economics, the social protection systems is skewed, is being kind of, how to put it, is being put to serve the interest of only certain groups. It's not while excluding the other groups. So that was my short comment.
Going back to what I was saying is, I think to a great extent, with very few exceptions that are operational to beyond their temporality, I think we operate within a condition of, let's say, tamed instability. So we provide instability, but it's tamed because I'm continuing my thread of thought. So I would be happy with this, let's say, division or creation of tribals, because you're talking about ecosystems, and ecosystem is full of different types of organisms from smaller to bigger. Some of them are parasitic, some of them are normal, they coexist, but there is some sort of circle if we use this kind of ecological let's say metaphor. So I wouldn't be necessarily, I don't think it's a trick question maybe. I don't know if it's a real question. It's more of an existential question, like a lot of our colleagues said, in terms of what to do when you feel completely helpless. And at the same time, there is a lot of responsibility that comes with the territory or a lot of great talk. And I think there are the ideological differences. And it's not only what you said, like how it's been washed down because we try to keep the autonomy or the independence of the art, so ideology or any kind of direct political comment might jeopardize, let's say, the integrity of the art. But it's the fact that we don't really talk about ideology. So when we all come, and also let's say self-perception, we always consider ourselves working in culture from the left down. We always consider that we are the subjects of censorship, we are the objects of receiving censorship, being prosecuted. You know, we always believe that we are on the side of the victim. This creates also a different type of approach when it comes to incorporating different groups like migrants, or I'm talking about integration. This perception of you as always being part of the weak, I think this is what we should be let's say, addressing our positioning and our kind of self-perception that we are part of the same group of the people that we are trying to facilitate, act as advocates, support, work with, work for. I think this is a misunderstanding, and this is definitely an existential thing. And as far as tribalism is concerned, I think in my country, if we talk about, at least let's bring the nationality element, I think the last years we have been experiencing cannibalism instead of tribalism within the art sector because the pie is so small. Different and external factors have landed into different spaces. The state being non-existent or degrading culture as an accessory. So you went, since 2009, you were going into ministries and if you were talking about projects or investment in projects, and they were saying, but we don't have hospitals, we don't have schools, so culture can wait? Question mark. Something like culture can be some sort of element that we have on the table, and it's like a side to a main course. Like sometimes you can skip salad, or you can have it on the side, and then it doesn't matter if 10 years down the line you don't have it. You can just bring it in, and it will participate in the discussions as if it were omnipresent, ever acting. So that's the one. And the second is so many independent initiatives exist, and they don't exist because they're sustainable, they exist because of personal investment. And they exist and they replicate stuff not because people are making money or they're sustainable. So once these independents are not able anymore due to personal reasons to continue, say very basic things, they have family or they get sick, these initiatives are not possible to continue operating. So the cannibalism is also who gets what from a 5%. including also two, in my country, very powerful private institutions that are redefining in a very European way and with the right type of vocabulary, but this is very dangerous, public space, commoning, community work, mapping, all these things that we all try to do. So I think, going back to Emina as well, I think language is always betraying us. English is also the basic language we all communicate, so ideologically we have some problem because we don't really understand to the fullest what the other person is saying. And I think we should also address the vocabulary that we're using that has been abused in a way that is beyond comprehension.
I think, and I agree what was said already, we need disputes in culture. We need firmer positions. We need to be clear about what we are doing and what is our ideology, because there is always an ideology. Saying this is not ideology, it's end of history, blah, blah, it's also ideology, right? It's quite clear, and I don't think any culture institution or culture actor anywhere in society is really neutral. Maybe they are trying to hide. Maybe this is the way, the technocratic way of survival, but it's always a clear, but there is always some kind of position. The problem today is that the ideologies are not made as a big picture society change, a vision, or anything, for many reasons, because, we have this history where these visions were shared by one person and all that, that this is also the danger of it. But I don't think it still means we shouldn't be at least trying to get in some kind of vision what is tomorrow. What I'm afraid most, not that much of war and all that, I'm afraid of these attempts that public policies are disappearing, and that thanks to technology and big technological companies like Google, etc., our administrators, let's call them like this because they're not politicians anymore, our administrators of the tax money would build your personal policy, because you will have your watch watching you, how you are acting. I mean, this is not my crazy thinking or literature, this is a real fact. And then the health policy won't be built on general ideas such as everybody should have right to, to health system, healthcare, etc. But yes, you've been smoking yesterday. Your health, you don't have your right because you were not responsible. It will be individualized.
Nieodpowiedzialnie, więc
Control and individualized, and in that idea, we are really losing any opportunity to have meaningful disputes and negotiations in society, and we are using completely public sphere in the most general idea of it, and we are becoming individual animals doing what? We have social Darwinism there, and there we go again. Thank you.
Zgadzam się.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think that what matters most in culture and the arts is diversity. And that's something we should fight for. That's something that deserves a place that ought to exist, a diversity of views, diversity of statements. And Emina, it's very important what she said, that we ought to build we ought to create larger projects, more sweeping, take the broader view of what's happening, so as to think of the future, especially today in culture and the arts. Culture and the arts can oppose what we see in the media, can oppose the topical, what we're being bombarded by on TV and in the social media, this topicality, this current affairs. And the theater stage is, I feel, a good space in which one can, in a broader and more responsible way, think about the future, consider what will happen to us in 10, 20 years. So this diversity and responsibility in the choices we make, in the artistic activity we undertake, and for all of it to hold water, for all of it to make sense and coexist. And it's something I keep saying, we need education. That's the main task for all of us. That's also a way of saving the world, maybe. That's also hope. Yes, we all deserve a break, I think, so I'd like to thank our panelists again.